Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
Welcome to 1987. Don't forget that when you date your checks. But before we depart from 1986 altogether, we want to talk about some of the things that happened last year. Who is the typical man of the year of 1986? Is it a William Poindexter, Oliver North? Is it an Ivan Boesky? Guys we hadn't heard of before, but boy, do we know who they are now. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about 1986, the newsmakers, what happened, what was significant, and what it means for us in 1987, nationally, internationally, and here in Indiana. Our panelists are Bill Mosier from the Ball State Department of Marketing, Cecil Bohannon from Economics, and John Rouse from Political Science. John, what is our theme today? What is it that we want to look at as we review 1986?
You know, it's the issue of shared values. It's the fact that we're just finishing a holiday season, and during the holiday season, we think about values and the meaning of life and this kind of thing. And the issue today that we should look at, I think, is the issue of consensus in society. Consensus in terms of political participation, the issues that we face economically, foreign policy. And as we look at the concern, that's the issue, shared values and the particulars of these shared values.
Okay, what does that mean for us? Apply it to 1986.
Okay, in terms of 1986, I'll defer to Bill and Cecil in terms of the economic and consumer kinds of concerns, but politically I would think the issue is one of obedience versus self-discipline. Now, the issue is kind of a strange dichotomy in a sense, but if you look at the Iran case, that's very much a concern now in terms of the consensus, in terms of what kinds of shared values support that consensus. The issue is perhaps one of abuse of power. If you look at abuse of power in this century, we have to look at Harding in 1920, we have to look at Nixon some 12 years ago, and so that's the question. And it's difficult to have self-discipline as long as there's no consensus for support. If there's a consensus in the public for support of the president, the people will support the president. The issue that we don't know in terms of the smoking gun is how far did the country money go in terms of the support perhaps for opposing Democratic candidates in the last election. So this is something we'll find out in 1987.
Well, I mean, it seems to me part of what's going on with the Iran Gate case has been called. If you look at the other things that have happened in this century with respect to abuses of power, these things are peccadillos. They're very small. They're not terribly important. I mean, there's been laundering of funds for years into political campaigns, all kinds of ways, by Republicans and Democrats. It seems to me one of the big things, though, is that Ronald Reagan has made his name and has been held in esteem by the American public because of the absence of those kinds of things directly tied to him and to his administration. And what is being lost here is not so much the crimes are so bad as it is they're tarnishing the image of what was a very popular president for 6 years.
In other words, there wasn't that much precedent during that period, and this is the first really significant.
Yeah, it's been politics as usual. That's really what's gone on with this. It's been politics as usual. But the president hasn't been a politician as usual. At least he hasn't been conceived as that in the minds of the American public.
Well, hasn't Ronald Reagan, though, with his big win in 80, his big re-election in 84, hasn't he considered himself a president of consensus, one of a mandate that he had and that he's had the support of the American people?
So far, but the problem, you know, Cecil, I agree with you, but the issue is one of theme and confidence and procedure and credibility. And so you have two kinds of concerns. You have the substantive concern in terms of should the money have gone to Iran, and then you have the question about the money in terms of did it go to the Contras, did it go to support opponents of the president's party? That's the potential smoking gun. And the issue is one of consensus in terms of support for a theme of pluralism. And if the president expects support, this kind of thing should not happen.
Well, I think he's in a real difficult position because what's he going to do? He's not the kind of president that likes to cut people out. He's not the kind of president that likes to cut people off. He's not the kind of president that likes to sabotage what he can view to be loyal employees simply because the press is hounding him. So that's one instinct I think the man has. But I think one of the things he came up with that I thought was interesting is let the people that are participants in the activities testify with partial immunity. And it's a question of whether or not you, quote, want to get the truth out as the first priority, or whether or not you really want to punish people if there's been wrongdoing.
The thing that used to occur in American society, when we would discuss foreign policy, the discussion would stop at the water's edge. But we live in a very complex international world now where you cannot depend upon obedience. You have to depend upon the good conscience of people, and that's how self-discipline comes in. I think the three big issues that really impacted or influenced me in terms of this kind of thinking in the last year was the fact that, first of all, how do we reside as citizens of the world? How do we deal in terms of foreign policy versus, things like South Africa, Chile, and that kind of use of power? Secondly, an issue I'm sure that you guys will address is the issue of protectionism and how do we become more productive. A third issue that we face here locally is one of community and how the community trains us and educates us so we can be better producers in terms of what we go to the marketplace to do and also how we deal with the citizens of the world. So that's a very broad brush, but it's a very difficult issue and there's no consensus as to how to confront those kinds of concerns.
Well, I think, John, those are really so new, and we're really, relatively speaking, neophytes in dealing in world issues. We still are not particularly good because we have thought an awful long time about ourselves as being very much insulated. In other words, in business, we are latecomers in doing good international business dealings, people from the United States. We still do not relate to the variations in culture and that sort of thing. I think we're still we're gaining headway, but we're very slow to pick up on that, don't you think?
It's very hard for us to do that. We live in a very large, insulated country where we all speak the same language and all have common cultural values.
Which makes it even more important that we work at that and really recognize that if we're going to be part of a world market, though.
Well, I think that's going to happen, but very naturally, Europeans and Asians, I think, are more attuned to international perspective, not because they're intrinsically more cosmopolitan than we are.
Oh, no, but
simply
it's a reality.
If you live in Belgium, you're 50 miles from France. So you better learn some French and understand a little bit about what a Frenchman thinks and how he operates, because that's your natural market.
So we actually have a disadvantage in this changing situation. We have to work harder in the United States to cope with that, with the transition, with the challenges they're involved in, right?
If we can define the Reagan Revolution, which came to an end a couple of months ago, it would be, in my own thinking at least, is that, as I've said before in this program, that Republicans have come to accept government, whereas Democrats have come to accept limited government. But the issue is still out there. How do we manage the national community in terms of what are the priorities and how do we get at it? And that has not been defined.
Well, don't you feel like an awful lot of people are uncomfortable with the developments of the past months because the Reagan administration's one, that you had delegation of responsibility and this sort of thing, and from appearances now, there's a question whether that delegation really worked. There were things being done that weren't communicated up to the top level. In other words, there are people, middle management, if you will, levels, that were making major decisions. And so there are people that are uncomfortable. You go back to the Carter administration, and he was involved more directly in things. And Reagan was less involved and gave the responsibility to people. He delegated that responsibility. Now people are saying, whoa, wait a minute. Maybe that delegation's not working because there's an awful lot going on down there at that level that affected the United States image. It affected business. There are just a lot of different things that were really Reagan apparently was unaware of. And people are not sure they're comfortable, I would think, with who's steering the ship, so to speak.
Well, I'm wondering on the whole issue of foreign policy, whether or not consensus is possible in the United States within the confines of having to have a coherent foreign policy. Can we have both? A foreign policy that the American public agrees with and simultaneously a foreign policy that's not filled with contradictions. It seems to me one of the problems is that in the United States, to the extent foreign policy is subject to popular whim and subject to popular, what shall we say, reproachment, so to speak.
A political
consumerism. That the president simply cannot continue with long-run kinds of policies. I mean, whether you agree with the Iran policy or not, what was the point of it? The point of it was to try to guard the strategic long-run interests of the United States.
But the point was that he...
secret diplomacy and covert action cannot be done by the president, isn't it possible that we cannot have an effective foreign policy?
No. The Constitution involves the Congress, and the problem was that the Congress was not involved with this. A lot of other people seem to know about this problem, but the Congress wasn't informed about it. And it's a procedural constitutional issue.
But is it? I mean, when did Franklin Roosevelt inform Congress about sending...
but that wasn't post-Watergate. You have different laws on the books about
it.
But
again, that's my point. My point is fundamental changes have occurred in American foreign policy, so that I would argue foreign policy cannot be as coherent as it used to be. We cannot have any long-run foreign policy because we're subject to political whims. Now, John, you're talking about in terms of Congress. I'm saying that's part of the problem.
Well, I wouldn't say that the consensus would be stable, but it would be fluid. And a consensus involves institutions, and not just one institution. And the institution we're talking about now, of course, is the presidency.
You're seeing the consensus then almost like an ideal that you're working toward, rather than something that's just concrete and it's defined.
Well, a consensus as opposed to a mandate. I still think Ronald Reagan is operating under the theory that he has a mandate based on his 2 overwhelming elections to do to carry out his idealistic policy. And that's how Oliver North is a hero, is that under this system, the ends does in fact justify the means.
But the system's much bigger than any one person or any one institution. And that's where I think the mistake was made.
But I don't think you can run foreign policy by consensus. I think what we do is we have a commander-in-chief, and the commander-in-chief makes decisions, and he does things. And we might not always agree with what he does, but we give him wide latitude in being able to do a lot of things. I think that's what the framers of the Constitution intended, and I think the post-Watergate era has really tied the hands of the president, made it impossible to have any kind of coherent foreign policy.
Yeah, well, I think we probably disagree. So.
Good. Sounds that way. What are we going to find out in 1987? I mean, you're talking about a Ronald Reagan whose credibility has been badly damaged. You're talking about a president who is already a lame duck going into his next to last year of his term. Is there any effectiveness with Ronald Reagan remaining? I mean, what can he accomplish?
His skills are really yet to be tested. We've heard a lot about his communication skills. In the next 2 years, we will really see how expert he is at communicating with people who disagree with him, Congress. And the White House and the Congress will attempt to come up with some kind of, I don't want to get into that word again, consensus about foreign policy and other kinds of issues.
Did 1986 set the stage for us to elect a Republican or a Democratic president in 88? Is Iran-gate big enough?
No.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I mean, the people of this country are pragmatic, and the politicians are pragmatic. And I think when politicians make their mistakes, and long ago I adopted the policy of never defending a politician because I don't know one that's worth defending, is to focus upon their policies and the pragmatism of their policies. And if the Democrat in 1988 responds to the people in terms of the needs of the people from a broad perspective, a Democrat has a good chance of being elected. At the same time, a Republican has a good chance of being elected.
But the Watergate of 73, and more specifically 74, did have an effect on the 76 election.
Sure, but it all depends if the White House can bring this thing to a close.
I mean, it appears at this juncture that the Iran-gate thing is a few little wild boys going bad, whereas the Watergate episode was complete, at least viewed in the minds of people, as complete corruption throughout the entire administration from top to bottom. I think that's going to be viewed as being fundamentally different.
See, the difference between Watergate and Iran is that Watergate involved entry into the opposition's political party headquarters. That kind of corruption has not been proven at this point.
I mean, the Iran-gate emanates from what most people would perceive as a bad foreign policy decision. Watergate emanated from a criminal act, and there's something very different from that.
But the Reagan administration also, I think another contrast is that they are responding, even though you have the problem with North and some of the ones pleading the Fifth Amendment, you still have more of an openness than you had during the Nixon administration. In other words, there was more stonewalling then than there is now. And that's the thing that's probably going to quench the thing or cool it down more quickly, rather than it building up and erupting even worse this time as opposed to Watergate, wouldn't you
I wonder
say?
what it's going to do to George Bush's chances, though. I would have to think he has to be tarnished by this.
Well, I mean, I don't mean to change the subject, but I think the Republicans have other kinds of problems dating back to November of '86, and that's the issue: will the Republicans ever control the houses of Congress? And I think the real concern is that the Republicans, if they respond ideologically, have less chances of maintaining majorities in the Senate and the House. And Republicans tend to go into business, and their best people tend to go that route to the corporate areas. The Congress, the House of Representatives, requires a great deal of patience and a great deal of consensus and compromise and negotiation, and it's not a place of ideology. It's a place of consensus. That's the reason the Republicans in Indiana do so well, and I'm thinking of Senator Lugar and Senator Quayle. These are not ideological politicians, but on a broader scale, country-wise, you got to ask the question, will the Republicans ever win the House of Representatives in Washington, the Senate again, unless there's a major disaster by Democrats, as was the case in 1980 with Carter?
Well, isn't the argument that sometimes, then I think there's a certain degree of credence to it. We want an ideologue as president. Maybe we want one as a senator, but we certainly don't want one as a congressman. To the extent that's the case, we want a Republican president, maybe a Republican senator, but a Democrat in Congress.
It's rather interesting. That seems like that's what's happened for many, many years. So,
well, you have the check and balance. The Republican president focuses upon productivity and efficiency.
Right.
The Democratic Congress focuses upon protectionism and benefits and guarantees and equality and those kinds of values.
Okay, let's draw a fine line here for a few minutes and move somewhat away from politics and talk about the economy, although we talk about the political economy here. 86, not a bad business year. Not a boomer, but not bad.
Right.
So
Right.
Is that a fair characterization?
I think that's a fair characterization.
Is that what we expected? I thought a year ago, 15 months ago, I had people like you on here telling me that we were on the verge of a recession.
Well, I guess that was wrong, because that certainly hasn't happened. I think what we found is that the economy's shown remarkable resilience at all levels. And we see ourselves being in what we would generally call a sideways trend, which means none of the statistics are very glamorous or very dramatic. And that's one of the things we see for 87, too, that I think is very interesting. Most of the forecasts for 1987 indicate, if anything, very minor changes in most of the economic statistics.
well, there's not really anything to give it that sort of boost, is there, Cecil? I mean, it's rather just stable and conservative.
Right. It seems to me, just looking at some of the figures I have in front of me, is the one thing that might change in 1987 from 1986 is some change in the trade deficit. But again, to show you the drama of it, it's that the trade deficit is going to go from $110 billion in the red to $80 billion in the red. And that's the biggest statistical change anyone's forecasting for 1987. We're viewing unemployment maybe changing by 1 or 0.2%, one direction or another, depending on the forecast you look at. You're looking at inflation maybe going from 2% to 3%. You're looking at a fairly stable economy that's going to have a fairly slow growth pattern, which means not a lot of jobs are going to be created that are high-paying jobs. And that has some relevance for Indiana.
Let me put you on the spot on that then, Cecil. If we have that situation in the United States, is that unique? Is that representative? Is the world pretty much in a stagnant pattern, a
in a
sideways?
holding pattern, too, to a large measure. The European economies are growing at a rate of about 2% real growth a year. The Japanese economy is going into a slowdown. The Asian economies are beginning to flounder.
So we are part of that world market.
The world market, where we have a growth rate of the gross national product worldwide level of about 2.5% a year.
Cecil, in 1980, when President Reagan ran, he emphasized the deficit. When former Senator Mondale ran, former Vice President Mondale ran in 1984, he emphasized the deficit. In 1980, he said the deficit is very, very important and we have to cut it. Now they're saying the deficit is not so important. What's the truth on this?
Well, I don't know. I'm not going to answer that one either.
An honest economist, I suppose, here.
Obviously, a country cannot run deficits ad infinitum without eventually running up against the market barrier of creditworthiness. It's why the government can run deficits, because people view that the debt they are issuing can be paid back at some day. To the extent that's the case, we eventually run into a roadblock where we simply can't run any more of the deficit. And that's the final sort of the ultimate thing that could occur. That's when the whole house of cards would fall down. And apparently a few European countries, and certainly a lot of Latin American countries, have gotten themselves in that kind of situation. where the government has borrowed so much that they have no creditworthiness left. And that can be a disaster. We're a long way from that, so in that sense, the deficit doesn't matter. But on the other hand, if the government's extracting resources from the private economy through a deficit, that's just another way of government, shall we say, getting fat from the goose one way or another. So it's not at all obvious whether deficits are better or worse than taxes. Taxes have bad aspects to them. Deficits have bad aspects to them. It's basically pick your poison, and I don't think anyone really understands which one's worse.
It really ties back to what we were saying as far as the outlook. If a business has debt, it's not a big problem if there is a chance to earn revenue in the future.
Exactly.
And if we don't have a growing economy, if we're in a situation where it's just stagnant, then it's harder to correct that deficit.
Sure.
In other words, you have a longer period of time, you're servicing the debt.
That's right. And there's no way we're going to be able to grow our way out of the deficit when we're dealing with 2.5% growth. I don't see any way we can get out of anything else but 2.5% growth. There's no magic formula to make growth go up to 5 or 6% a year.
If I can ask both of you this question, of course, one of the big issues last year, of course, was the issue of tax reform. And my understanding of tax reform is that you don't have any more money brought into the Treasury.
Right.
The thing is that's revenue neutral.
Right.
That different sets of people pay more and different sets pay less. Okay. How is this going to impact the consumer and the overall economy?
Well, the idea behind it is that you lower marginal tax rates for consumers and corporations. That'll give them an incentive to work more, to invest more, and that's right. But on the other hand, simply rearranging a tax burden from individuals to corporations of $120 billion has to have some profound effect on the tendency of corporations to invest and to expand. So my suspicion is that in the long run, the tax reform package will probably be all right and probably will contribute in a fairly minor fashion to growth rates in the economy. But in the intermediate term and in the short term, it's just a wash.
So what you're really saying, is you've got to put quotes around in the long run.
Right,
It's
absolutely.
not something we're going to see.
As a matter of fact, in the very short run, it may be detrimental to the economy simply because it will encourage so many relocations of capital and so many relocations of industry.
Let's bring it home to Indiana, though.
Good.
Let's look at the situation as far as the industries we have. Do you feel like most people, I guess we were talking before the program, the conventional wisdom was that we primarily have agriculture and heavy industry. We don't have as much, although in Indianapolis you're getting more in the element of service, but still basically we don't have a big element of light industry and that sort of thing.
The heart of the Indiana economy is manufacturing and farms.
So what does that mean that the new tax code is going to do to Indiana? Is it going to be a positive issue or a negative issue?
Well, clearly, it would seem as though in the short run and certainly in the intermediate run, the change in the tax code, the elimination of investment tax credits, the elimination of accelerated depreciation, couldn't do anything but hurt existing business in Indiana.
Okay.
Now,
which is not unique to, it's really true of the Midwest.
It's true of the Midwest. However, I would argue those weren't going to be the growth industries anyway.
Okay.
The growth industries when they come other places. So maybe in the long run, the tax reform package might help Indiana more.
It accelerate the reality.
Sure, exactly. Some people argue that the key to growth is killing off your old dying industries. So to the extent that the tax reform package does that quicker than what would have been done otherwise, in the long run, it might be good for Indiana.
You know, picking up on the Indiana focus, I think the issue locally, politically, is going to be the perhaps the new viability of the Democratic Party in this state. Evan Bayh was elected Secretary of State. That gives the Democrats a statewide position in terms of some influence and also some prospects. But I think also as we look at the House of Representatives, it is now 52-48 in favor of the Republicans. And so the real ball game perhaps here in Indiana politically is going to be in the state Senate. So if for the last 8 or 10 years, it seems to me that the Democrats as a political party in Indiana have not been viable. And we perhaps can look to more viability in asking the Democrats, how are you going to solve the crucial problems that we have in society here locally?
We'll have a year politically to cool our heels somewhat, though. Obviously, 1987 is the municipal election year, so the focus will be on the grassroots, city councils, town boards, mayors. There maybe we'll find out where the strength is. Although Democrats have traditionally done quite well, have won a lot of those local offices, but have been unable to win state offices. Are you saying this has changed now?
No, that's a good point, because I think we should emphasize the fact that most of our immediate concerns occur at the local level. And oftentimes we look too far away to the state or to the national government. And most of the concerns in terms of the quality of life, a phrase used on this program previously, is one that is decided at the local level.
Well, we're seeing more of that too, whether it's a delayed effect of the new federalism of the Reagan administration, but revenue sharing funds are now kaput. There's that funnel from Washington no longer helping fund local governments, counties and cities specifically. And they're having to look at new ways to impose taxes locally. Are we not beginning to feel that tax shift that started with the individual income tax cut that Reagan and Jack Kemp gave us in 1981? Are we not beginning to see that on a local level saying, hey, those were the dollars. When we cut your taxes, you're not getting the money back from
It'll
Washington.
probably be a measure of which cities are well managed. That's what it really boils down to. Who can deal with this transition of the loss of the federal revenue?
Well, I think that's the whole idea behind the elimination of revenue sharing, is that local governments are intrinsically more competitive than national governments. And if you hand out funds at a national level to local governments, it gives them absolutely no incentive to be efficient.
You know, I think as we look at the themes again, if you think of patriotism, and we hear a lot about patriotism. Patriotism, to me, is three things. It's honesty, it's corruption, and that kind of thing. It's productivity in terms of being productive at our jobs, and it's also fairness. And so we're going to see these three things focused upon in specific, particular kinds of ways as they impact all of us. Are we being productive? Are we fair to our fellow person in terms of hiring and firing, promotions and that kind of thing in the marketplace? And are we honest with ourselves in terms of, do we do an honest day's work? And is the system honest in an overall sense?
And the bottom line is going to be, I guess, in your contribution to...
The bottom line in our society is productivity and efficiency, because we are a capitalistic system first.
Dealing in a world market now.
Of course, you're going into 1987 city elections. We have city officials saying, okay, folks, if you want the services we're providing, you're going to have to pay more for them.
And the pressure is going to be on those politicians, Republicans or Democrats, to deliver those services as they've had in the past at the most efficient price.
But they're going to ask you to pay a price for it, right?
Well, absolutely.
A higher price
Yeah,
for it.
I mean, a higher price. I mean, the problem with the citizen is they want something for nothing. And if they're going to have better education in Indiana, if they're going to have better services, they're going to have to pay for it, and perhaps more.
Okay, folks, that's 1986. We're in 1987. Make your resolutions, place your bets. Thanks to our panelists, Cecil Bohannon, Bill Mosher, and John Rouse for the commentary. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosher. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.